Hey folks, welcome to the lecture now on Chapter 7 on Consumer and Producer Surplus and Market Efficiency. So the way we're progressing, I think, is really good. We started off with the basics of supply and demand. We talked about elasticity. Then we put the supply and demand model to use in terms of helping us understand economic outcomes associated with a few government policies, in particular price ceilings and price floors, and then taxes. And I hope you're already starting to see how many implications we can draw from this model of supply and demand, how much we can understand about the world from this really simple, really straightforward, workable model. I think it's really cool. But again, I'm nerdy like that, so whatever, you can make fun of me and tell your friends I'm a nerd. I'm not going to cry over it. Anyway, we're going to continue on in Chapter 7 and draw more implications about markets using this model of supply and demand. So we're even getting more value out of the model of supply and demand on this Chapter 7 lecture. So I'll remind you, we're still operating in the context of what we call perfectly competitive markets. Like I said before, we have this whole spectrum of markets in the real world. Perfect competition is on one side, monopoly is on the other side, and we have this wide array of kind of real world markets in the middle. But we're still on that extreme where we're talking about perfect competition. And with perfect competition, we're talking about, that model just like we described before, with a large number of buyers and sellers. They exhibit price-taking behavior, and they're selling a homogeneous product. Like we said before, you go to the market, you sell widgets. We're not talking about high-quality widgets versus low-quality widgets or whatever. All the products are the same. All the widgets are the same. If you look on the top of my notes from this chapter, you'll see three specific assumptions that I've laid out. This model of perfect competition, everything that we're going to do in this Chapter 7 lecture rests on these three assumptions. Now don't worry, we'll come back and talk about violations of these assumptions later, right? We're going to establish more real-world models later, but we have to start in this kind of real clean, really nice, really neat case, and then incorporate real world complexity as we go. But here we're assuming still good information. People have full information about the product they're buying, the product they're selling, their options. We're talking about perfect information. As I already said, we're talking about competitive markets. We're talking about price-taking behavior. No seller, or even for that case, no buyer, has the power to influence market price. You just go to the market, whatever the prevalent price is, that's what you take. That's the end of the story. And we're talking about no externalities. Remember, an external cost or an external benefit is when the actions of one economic agent directly affect the utility or the well-being of another economic agent. But we're assuming that away here. When I go and buy or sell something in the market, that doesn't affect anybody else. There are no external costs or benefits. So we're going to start off by talking about this concept of consumer surplus. This is a really important concept in terms of understanding efficiency implications of markets. That's where we are right now. I'm going to go to my screen share so you can see my chicken scratch over here. Hopefully you're getting used to my chicken scratch, and maybe hopefully you can read that now that you're getting used to my writing. My dad used to always give me, hell when I was a kid about how bad my writing was, and it was just impossible for me to improve it. So, oh well. So here we are. Just think back to the demand curve. And remember, the key here is remembering that demand is the same thing as marginal value. Okay? For this first unit of a good, right, the additional value, the additional well-being that a consumer receives from that first unit is reflected in the demand curve, in the height of the demand curve. So this amount, right, whatever this number is right here on this axis, that's the amount of additional value that the consumer receives for this first unit of the good. Second unit of the good, just read off the demand curve, that shows the consumer's marginal value. In some sense, the demand curve represents the value that the consumer receives from each unit of the good. That's what demand represents when we think of it as marginal value. So just say that this is the price. Don't worry about that. We're just assuming a random price just to make a point here. So consumer surplus, it's the difference between what a consumer receives and gives up. It's the difference between what a consumer receives and what a consumer gives up. So we've already established that at this price, the consumer will buy this many units of a good. Call that Q star, right? Beyond Q star, the cost of the good, right? The price is more valuable, or the cost is higher than the value that the consumer receives, right? Past Q star, this price is higher than the marginal value. A consumer would be stupid to buy beyond Q star. Consumer would be paying for something that is just not worth it to that consumer. So the consumer purchases at Q star, and then the total value the consumer receives for all these units is this entire area. This entire area under the demand curve represents the whole value that the consumer receives. This whole kind of, now what I've made into a darkened box, or darkened, I don't know, trapezoid or whatever shape that is, that's what the consumer receives in total. But the consumer gives up this much, right? What the consumer gives up is just the price times the quantity. So this square here at the bottom represents what the consumer gives up. The difference in what our focus is here is here. This triangle at the top is the consumer surplus. That's the difference between what the consumer gets and what the consumer gives up. And that represents the extra benefit that the consumer receives from engaging in this transaction. Right? The consumer is better off as a result of participating in this market, whatever this market is, the market for watermelons or whatever. The consumer is better off by this amount as a result of participating in this market. That's cool. That's the consumer surplus. Does that make sense? It should be a pretty straightforward concept. It's not that hard. Over here on producer surplus, what the heck? I can't find my mouse. On producer surplus, it's really the same idea. There's the supply curve, and remember the supply curve is the same thing as the marginal cost curve. Just assume we have this price. Just forget about where that price comes from. We're just using this for illustrative purposes. There's the price. This is how many units the firm would want to sell at that price. The producer surplus, it's the same thing. It's the difference between what the business receives and what the business gives up. So what the business receives, on the other hand, is this amount, right? The total revenue, the price times all the quantity that they're selling. This is the benefit that the business receives, okay? And now this area under the marginal cost curve, right? This is the marginal cost of the first unit. This is the marginal cost of the second unit. This is the marginal cost of the third unit. This area under the marginal cost curve is what the business gives up, okay? That's what they give up in terms of cost associated with producing these units. The difference between what the consumer gets and what the consumer gives up, it's this area here. That's the producer surplus. The business is better off by this amount as a result of participating in this market. Now here I just will put out a caveat. The producer surplus is a little bit more complicated because we are assuming that the business is operating at all. Here we're not incorporating fixed cost. We're only incorporating the marginal cost associated with producing the first unit, the second unit, the third unit. We're not incorporating fixed cost. So producer surplus is not quite the same thing as profit. We're going to come back later and talk about profit more specifically. And we're going to talk about the decision to be in a market at all versus to not be in a market. But in simple terms, that's the producer surplus. So if you just draw a figure like this, where we have the full market, There's the demand, the marginal value. There's the supply, which is derived from marginal cost. Here's the price that will prevail in that market. There's the quantity that will prevail in that market, of course. And then this area up here, for some reason, I like changing colors this morning. Oh, well. This area here is the consumer surplus. That area is the producer surplus. Okay? I want you to think about this. Here's the question. How much should be produced? Now, before in chapter 4, we talked about how much will be produced. We just talked about individual consumers, individual producers. We talked about how the price mechanism works, and we talked about how the market will settle at an equilibrium. Remember, any price could emerge in a market randomly, but prices are going to yield excess demands or excess supplies. When we have an excess demand or an excess supply, that's not going to be stable, and that's going to create pressure for the price to move. The price mechanism will move until we reach that equilibrium where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. There we were talking about how much will be produced in a competitive market, but now we're talking about how much should be produced. It's a different question. There's demand, which is derived from marginal value curves. There's supply, which is derived from marginal cost curves. So here's unit 1. And should unit 1 be produced? I'm just talking about this from a societal perspective. I just suppose you're God, right? You're not in this market. You're not a seller. You're not a buyer. You're just looking at this market from a distance. How much should be produced, assuming that we care about making people as well off as possible? That's what we're talking about here. Well, for the first unit, here's the marginal value, right? This number up here, that's how much society gains as a result of producing that first unit. This is the marginal cost associated, this number right here, that's the marginal cost associated with producing that first unit. The first unit is way more valuable to society than it is costly. The first unit should indeed be produced. Society, this distance between marginal value and marginal cost, right? This is what society gains as a result of producing the first unit. This marginal cost is what society gives up as a result of producing this first unit. Society is better off by this amount as a result of this market existing and producing the first unit. This is a total surplus, just the sum of consumer and producer surplus for the first unit. Same thing for the second unit. Here's what society gains for the second unit. This is the marginal value. That's the additional benefit consumers receive from consuming that second unit. Here's what society gives up in the form of marginal cost for producing that second unit. Society is better off as a result by this amount, by the fact that this market exists and the second unit was produced. This reasoning is true up until this point. For all these units, we're going to call this Q efficient, the efficient quantity. For all these units below Q efficient, those units are more valuable than they are costly, and they should be produced. Society is being made better off as a result of the existence of this market, of the production of these goods up until Q efficient. Beyond Q efficient, right, look up here. Beyond Q efficient, I'll use this pointer here. Beyond Q efficient, for this unit out here, the cost of producing the unit exceeds the value. It would be dumb to produce this unit. It would be dumb to produce a unit that's more costly than it is valuable. We don't want to produce this unit. At this point, beyond Q efficient, it would make more sense for us to devote our scarce resources to the production of some other good. Because here it doesn't make sense. Beyond this point, it would make sense for us to devote our scarce resources, our land, our labor, our capital, our time, to the production of some other good. So look at how beautiful this works out. The efficient quantity, the quantity that maximizes total surplus, right? The quantity that maximizes total sum of consumer and producer surplus is Q of fish. And lo and behold, that just happens to be the equilibrium quantity that emerges as we discussed in chapter 4. This is a key point in the class. This is where we get the idea that free markets are efficient. That is a huge point of economics. Here, you need to remember this. Whatever you do, don't forget this. This is a big deal. This is where we get the idea that free markets are efficient. Because, you know, it can be understood in this model. It can be explained, conceptualized pretty well, I think, in this model. Here you see, you can think about how much should we produce. And we've talked before about how the price mechanism works to make this the actual quantity that emerges in a free market. Remember, all of this happens when we have good information, price-taking behavior, and no externalities. And later we'll of course talk about, okay, well, what happens if we don't have good information? What happens if we don't have price-taking behavior? What happens if we don't have, well, let me back up. What happens if we do have externalities? Then we can talk about situations that deviate from this baseline classic case. But for now, this is where we get the idea that free markets are efficient. Free markets are devoting their scarce resources to the production of this good up until that good is more valuable than it is costly. But beyond that point, free markets don't produce more. Their resources are directed towards the production of other goods in that case. Okay, does that make sense? So here we're going to talk about a price floor, just to illustrate that point a little bit more. A price floor and the efficiency implications thereof. A price floor and how that affects efficiency. There's demand, marginal value. There's supply, derived from marginal cost curves. And then you can see the efficient quantity, and you can see, this quantity is Q of fish. It's the efficient quantity, and it's Q star. It's the equilibrium quantity that emerges in a free market. And I could diagram over here, this area up here would be the consumer surplus that would emerge from this market. This area here would be the producer surplus that would emerge from this market. I'm just going to extend these curves out just a little bit. So suppose government comes in and imposes a price floor. Let's just call that the minimum price. That's the lowest price that you can charge for this good. Well, in this case, this will become the new quantity. That will become the quantity demanded. Quantity supplied is going to be much higher. Quantity supplied is going to be out here. But, oh well, the price mechanism isn't allowed to adjust to achieve an equilibrium or a stable point. We're going to have this permanent excess supply in this case, because this is all that consumers will buy, Q2. So here's the minimum price. So again, consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers get and what they give up. So they get this entire amount, all this surplus, right? All this value, all this amount under the demand curve is the value that the consumers receive, and what they give up is reflected in this triangle right here. That's what they give up in terms of the price that they pay to producers. Consumer surplus becomes this amount, consumer surplus. And likewise, producer surplus, here's the total revenue that the producers receive. Here's the cost for each unit that producers incur. assuming they are operating at all and incurring those fixed costs. There's the producer surplus. So what do we see here? Let's switch over to green. This area here, this triangle, well, lo and behold, that would have been part of the surplus before, but it's not. It's just disappeared. It's no longer part of the surplus. This is a really important concept. This is called the dead weight loss. The dead weight loss. Society is worse off as a whole as a result of the price floor by that amount. Whatever that triangle amounts to, the value encompassed in that triangle, society is worse off as a whole by that amount because this price floor has prevented the free market from working and achieving the efficient level of output. See, for all these units in between Q2 and Q of fish, for all those units are more valuable than they are costly, right? The marginal value for those units exceeds the marginal cost. Those units are more valuable than they are costly, but they're not being produced. That doesn't make any sense. This is a messed up outcome. Doesn't make any sense that these units aren't being produced, but they're not being produced because the price floor and the way the price floor has affected markets. So this is a bad outcome. This is a suboptimal outcome. The price floor, the government intervention in the form of a price floor in this free market has impeded overall efficiency. It's prevented society from achieving the maximum overall gains that it can receive from this market. Here's some homework for you. Well, here, by the way, that is it. That is all that there is to Chapter 7. We will use this concept of consumer and producer surplus in later chapters, and certainly we'll use this concept of dead weight loss in later chapters. That's a big concept that I refer back to a lot. But that's it for the chapter. It's a simple, short, straightforward chapter. Do this. Go in for practice and draw the graph for a price ceiling, right? I show the example of a price floor. I'm not going to bother to draw it out, but you go in and do the example of a price ceiling and depict the dead weight loss. In that case, that'll be good extra practice for you. That's it. I'll see you soon with the next chapter.